Okay, so what we're going to see here is a very simple PowerPoint animation that I made to try and illustrate what happens when plates separate. Now, before, if you imagine Pangaea and the supercontinent, then perhaps there was a species that existed right the way across Pangaea, as we've seen through the evidence presented for continental drift. And within that population, that species and that population, there are, in this case, 3 different versions of a gene. So there's biodiversity, genetic diversity. Okay, and any one of these individuals could potentially interbreed with another individual. Okay, now that's the definition of a species, that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And potentially, if we think about the ratites we're going to meet, then there would have been a common ancestor that had genes present within it, versions of the genes that all these current species at one point shared. But what happens when the supercontinent started to separate? Okay, and then we've got a barrier forming. So the plates started to pull apart and the barrier formed, and now this population is no longer one population, it's 2 populations, but the southern population in this case only has 2 versions of the gene, whereas the northern version still has all 3 populations. But now what we've got is we've got 2 isolated populations, and that isolation means that the individuals can no longer interbreed. And so what starts to happen is that you've got divergent evolution happening. These 2 separate populations are able to evolve along different pathways because they have different selection pressures. And so eventually, say that barrier then no longer exists and these 2 what were populations come back together, then they're now 2 separate species because they will no longer interbreed. There's been sufficient evolution, sufficient time between those the separation of those 2 gene pools, that now we've got 2 separate populations, 2 separate species. So what we can say is that the separation of continental plates led to an increase in some cases of biodiversity.